Hi everyone and welcome back to Chess for Charity. In this video, we're going to solve a really cool chess logic puzzle. So imagine you walk up to a chessboard and two people are arguing, and they're both saying it's their move. The person who's playing the white pieces says, no, it's my move, it's checkmate in one. The person playing the black pieces say, no, it's my move, it's checkmate in one for me. Your job is to figure out who is right. Now that may seem like an impossible task, right? How do you know whose move it is? Well, with the position that you see on the board, it is possible to figure out, and we're going to do it together. If you'd like to first try it on your own, feel free to pause the video. You can pause it and try to see if you can decipher the logic behind it. If not, just sit back and enjoy the ride. It's quite a fun little logic string. And while you're here, I would encourage you to subscribe. Just a reminder that half of my income goes directly to charity, so every subscriber is a lot of help. It's free to you, but it helps a lot across the world. Okay, let's start looking at this position a bit. So you might notice all these pawns have not moved. Okay, easy enough. I also should say this came from a normal game of chess, not a 960 game, not some other type of variant, a normal game of chess. And I notice these knights in the corner. I see rooks kind of weird places. Okay, queens are not there. There's some knights there. Okay, we'll dissect that. How do I begin to think about whose move it might be? Well, I'm going to tell you how I thought about it. And feel free to give me some feedback on how I thought about it. It may not be the most efficient way, but it's the way I thought about it. So the first thing I did was I attacked this idea of the knight on g1. And I asked myself, how many moves would it take a knight on g1 in terms of evenness and oddness would it take to get from g1 to h8? Would it be even number of moves or an odd number of moves? Right? And I applied that same idea from g1 to h8 and even g1 to d1. What do I mean by that? Let me tell you. So if the knight on g1 was the one that ended up on h8, my question to you, is that an even number or an odd number of moves? Well, you would say, well, I don't know. Well, yes, you do, because look, every time you change color, you move, right? Or I should say maybe the other way around. Maybe every time you move, you change color. So 1 would be a change of color, and 2 would bring you back to your initial starting color, which means that if you started on G1, a dark square, and you ended up on H1, a dark square, you took an even number of moves. Okay, how is this important, you might wonder? We'll get there in a second. Okay, so if this knight went from g1 to h8, what does that mean about the other knight that started here on b1? Well, the same logic applies. This knight that was here, I know there's a rook here right now, the knight that was here ended up on d1. That would also be an even number of moves, right? Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be 2, right? It could be a bunch, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as long as it's even. And we know it's even because that's the way the chess knights work. So what can we conclude here? We can conclude that if the knight on g1 ended up on h8, it took an even number of moves. And that same logic applies to the knight on b1 to d1. Okay, now how is that helpful? You might say, well, it didn't have to be the case that the knight on g1 ended up here. It could have ended up on d1. And I would say that's a great thought. Let's explore it. So let's explore the thought. If the knight on g1 went to d1, that would be an odd number of moves, right? Because every time it changes color, it's odd, right? So 1 would be going here. 2 would be back to the color you started on. Since this is a different color, we know that it went an odd number of moves. So the knight on g1 to get to d1 would be an odd number of moves. And the same idea applies from the knight on b1 all the way over here to h8. Because they're different colors, it would be an odd number of moves. Now you might say, okay, I don't get where I'm going with this. Bear with me, please. It's pretty crazy, it's interesting, and hopefully you see where I'm going mathematically. Let's also make some general observations, now that I got that out of the way. That's kind of the crux of the problem, believe it or not. So the bishops didn't move, right? They have nowhere to move. We can say that pretty clearly and definitively. And let's just look at the white pieces for now. Bishops didn't move. The king did not move. Or if it did move, it had to come right back. That would be an even number. This rook didn't move. Or, just like the king, if it did move, it went somewhere and back. But this rook on b1 was on a1 and it ended up on b1. Which means we can look at exactly what I just said and say the queen, the bishops, the king, and the rook on a8, if we're starting with the black pieces, didn't move. Or if it did took an even number of moves. So I think that should be h1. Sorry about that. Okay, what am I saying now? Well, if everything here, 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 and here took an even number of moves, but this rook on b1 took an odd number of moves, what does that mean? Well, like I just said, the rook on b1 took an odd number of moves. That means white had an odd number of moves total. Okay, now you might say, I think I know where this is going, but bear with me if you don't quite yet. We're getting there. So now what our job is, now that we concluded that white took an odd number of moves, let's apply the same logic to black. So the knight that was on b8 and g8, let's look at their journeys. I'm going to go a little faster this time because it's kind of the same idea, and I want to make sure that you're with me. So the knight on b8, that one arrived on a1, we'll say. If it did, that's an even number of moves, right? And just like before, if this knight on b8 arrived on a1, even number, great. That means that this knight on g8 arrived on e8, and that would be an even number. And then similarly, it'd be the same idea the other way around. If the knight ended up on e8 and this knight ended up on a1, that'd be an odd and an odd. So in both cases, an even number plus an even number, or an odd number plus an odd number, both of those would be even. So we can conclude that the knights are going to add up to an even number of moves, no matter which way it is. Still with me? It's a lot of fun. I'm enjoying it. Okay, great. Now let's talk about the other pieces, though. So there's the bishop, the bishops. There's the king. There's the rook, the other rook, and this knight we already talked about. So we know the bishops didn't move, just like before. This rook didn't move. But this king, it was originally on e8, and then it shifted over here to d8. So that means the king had an odd number of moves, right? It could have gone there and back and there. That'd be 3. But it definitely went 1. Either 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on, right? That's the definition of odd. Okay, same thing with this rook. It started on h8. It had to move at least once, right? So let's think about what I'm actually saying here. We're saying that the king on d8 and the rook on g8 add up to an odd number of moves. Now, how do I get that conclusion again? Well, remember, this is going to be an addition of 1, and this is going to be an addition of 1. So each of those has an odd number of moves, right? You see that point? But what does that mean? That means that these two odds cancel each other out, and now that means that black took an even number of moves. Do you see what I'm saying now? This is where the crux of the problem is. It's actually the fact that this move and this king move, those two odds will add up to an even. What does that all mean? It means that white had an odd number of moves, but black had an even number of moves, which means it's black to move. So what does that mean for the grand scheme of things? It means that the answer to this puzzle can be easily found. Now that we know it's black to move, the winning move, knight c2, checkmate. So I hope you enjoyed that. There are lots of ways to think about it. My analysis is just the way that I thought about it. I'm sure you can find a more efficient way. Feel free to share them in the comments. I thought of the parity of it, the evenness and oddness of it. I hope it makes sense. If it doesn't, leave me some feedback. Go crazy in the comments. I love it. All the engagement makes me very happy. But that is it for now. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. Please like the video. It helps me out so much. I put a lot of work into these videos. Most of it's for charity, so it really makes me happy to see so much engagement. But that's it for now. Thank you so much. Bye.